Question number 4, Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Does the 30-year New Zealand infrastructure plan identify reduction of greenhouse gas pollution and adaptation to climate change as key challenges for infrastructure planning over the next 30 years? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, yes. Adaptation to and mitigation of climate change is discussed throughout the 30-year infrastructure plan. I refer the member to the executive summary of said plan, which says, and I quote, "Our climate is changing and our natural resources are under pressure. As a country, we have a wealth of natural resources, but we're beginning to deplete some of the important natural resources and are reaching limits of some of the crucial inputs such as land and fresh water. These issues raise questions around how we develop and manage our infrastructure. It needs to be resilient to changes over time and use resources efficiently." So when the member reads the plan, she will have much to look forward to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary?
Supplementary question, Julianne Genter.
Why is climate change not mentioned even once in the action plan on page 51 of the 30-year infrastructure report?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, actually, I'm not sure that the member's completely correct, although I would have to refer, because actually there is some references in a number of places in the report in regards to climate change. For example, there's a summary of future work that includes on page 69 advice to ministers and other departments about potential opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector, and also refers on page 80 to the Ministry for the Environment publishing updated climate projections for New Zealand and guidance to local government on coastal hazards and climate change. So I'm not sure there are no reports in there on climate change.
A lot of reading. Julianne's a numbers person.
Supplementary question, Julianne Genter.
What specific projects in the National Infrastructure Plan will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and what percentage of the overall spend on infrastructure do they make up?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I don't have that to hand, and I'm not sure that would be a practical way of presenting an infrastructure plan. The reality is all infrastructure has to take into account climate change. So, for example, if you're expecting sea level rise and you're building a bridge on a coastal environment, you'll probably build it a little higher than you would have perhaps in the past, and we see that a number of times in a number of infrastructure projects. You would also take a different approach, including what expectations you would have on transport mode use development and in a range of areas. But I don't think you could ascribe individual or many individual projects as directly a response of climate change. It's more the way you adapt the infrastructure development to both respond to and mitigate climate change.
Supplementary question, Julianne Genter.
Does he see the incoherence in an infrastructure plan that mentions climate in passing, but devotes over 80% of transport spending to projects that will increase carbon emissions rather than decrease them?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I just don't agree with the member's characterisation of transport projects, and this may come to a quite fundamental difference between the government and the Green Party on this matter, because the government doesn't believe that people will sacrifice their personal mobility over the next 50 years in response to climate change. We believe that actually they will change the fuel mix of their vehicles in response to climate change, but there'll still be cars, and there'll probably still be buses, and they will need roads, and that's the bulk of the transport projects the member refers to.
Supplementary question, Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What comments has the Minister seen on the 30-year infrastructure plan since its release earlier today?
The Honourable Stephen
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I've seen a number of comments, including a series of tweets from a well-known economic environmental commentator of some standing. And I quote, this person says, "The government announces 30-year infrastructure plan but doesn't mention the climate once. What planet are National living on?" I'm happy to refer that commentator to a number of places in the report. And if we could indulge the House briefly, the executive summary that I've already referred to. Page 16 talks about rising sea levels and increasing rainfall. Page 25 discusses reducing transport's share of greenhouse gases. Page 47 talks about adaptation, including climate change. Page 65 says the infrastructure unit will be informing responses to climate change. Pages 69 and 80 outline future work streams. So I expect the author of that tweet will find much to like in this report when she gets around to reading it.
Point of order.
Point of order, Julie and Genter.
I seek leave to table the Minister of Finance's speech, which mentioned climate change not once.
Order. The speech is available on the internet to all members.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Julie and Genter.
What is the Minister's response to the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, which calls on governments to prioritise infrastructure that reduces greenhouse pollution as the best way to achieve stronger economic performance, and amongst that infrastructure to prioritise public transport in urban areas?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I might have some awareness of exactly how much we've already done that, which is huge, actually. This government has arrived at a point and invested alongside local government to ensure that we have brand new electric commuter trains in both of our major cities, Auckland and Wellington. That has happened under this government, Mr. Speaker. This government has also invested hugely in public transport more generally. This government has invested more than any previous government in cycling. And I think if you look, this government has probably invested more in the rail sector than any government going back 50 or 60 years. So to suggest that this government and its infrastructure plan is not investing in the sorts of things the member would like, I think is simply incorrect.
Supplementary?
Supplementary question, Julie and Genter.
Apart from electrification of the rail network, which was promised by a previous government, are there any new major projects in the 30-year plan that will reduce emissions and enable New Zealand families and households and businesses to go about their daily lives without increasing carbon emissions? What are they, Minister?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I firstly must need to correct the member's incorrect version of the electrification in Auckland. It may have been wish-listed by a previous government, but it was funded and appropriated by this government in the face of the global financial crisis. And she can pretend that's not the case because it doesn't fit her narrative, but it isn't true. And in terms of the future, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in public transport, but as I pointed out to the member earlier, personal mobility is something that many New Zealanders hold in very high regard, and they won't necessarily sacrifice that because of the Greens wanting them to, but they will be prepared to change fuel sources, and that means that personal passenger vehicles, private passenger vehicles, will continue to be a very important part of the transport mix well into the future.
Point of order.
Supplement.
Mr. Speaker, point of order.
Point of order, Julie and Genter.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asked to seek your advice on this. I thought that the question was quite specific and asked which new projects.
No,
and I've asked that several times.
Order. I invite the member to go back and look at her question. She started by words to the effect of, apart from the electrification of rail, etc., that was done by a previous government, and then she led to a question, gave the opportunity for the Minister to respond to that part of the question. Supplementary question, Julie and Genter.
Is the Minister and the rest of the Cabinet living on another planet where somehow climate change is not going to affect infrastructure or change the way that people get around? Or will they join us in the real world where global business leaders are calling on governments to prioritise climate change, pollution reduction in their infrastructure planning?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, it's never a good idea to write your last supplementary question before you come down to the House. Mr. Speaker, because I've shown through all the answers that is completely different. And here's the plan, Mr. Speaker, and here's page 7 for the member with the reference to climate change. Here's a later page, page 47. Here's another page here, page 33. Here's another page here, page 69. Here's another page, page 80. If the member would like me to get my stickers out and highlight it for her and deliver it to her office, I'm more than happy to do so.
Get your highlighter out.
Question number 5, Stuart Smith.